The lab is quiet except for the hum of a centrifuge, and on the table sits one strand of hair, sealed in plastic, labeled with a location and a date. It could be nothing. It could be the first physical proof of Bigfoot ever confirmed by science. For over a decade, geneticists have quietly tested hundreds of these samples sent in by hunters, monasteries, and museums that never dared run the analysis. The results are in. Most of them solve nothing. But buried inside the data sits one match nobody expected, and it doesn't close the case. It deepens it, added up across every serious scientific attempt to test this creature. Every hair sample, every scrap of tissue, every strand pulled from a freezer bag or a museum drawer, and the number climbs past 273, if you count everything that has ever gone under a real microscope with real credentials attached to it. Not one lab, not one afternoon. Years of collection, across continents, funneled into a handful of geneticists willing to risk their reputations on a campfire story. That's the part people forget. Bigfoot is a joke until you realize actual scientists, the kind who publish in serious journals, decided the joke was worth testing properly. For most of the last century, Bigfoot lived exactly where the world wanted it to live, at the edge of the forest, in blurry photographs, and a costume rumor that refused to die. Thousands of sightings have been logged across North America alone. The 1967 Patterson-Gimlin footage turned a regional legend into a global obsession. A few seconds of shaky film that people have argued over for more than 50 years. Sasquatch, or Saskets, existed in indigenous oral tradition long before the word Bigfoot was ever printed in a newspaper. The creature became merchandise, mascots, punchlines, and primetime specials. And underneath all of it sat an assumption almost nobody questioned. There is no real evidence because there has never been a real test. There was also money in the legend staying alive. Towns like Willow Creek, California, built entire identities around the creature, calling itself the Bigfoot capital of the world, running a museum, a festival, a gift shop economy that depends on the mystery never fully closing. Sightings groups like the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization have logged reports for decades, building an archive that functions almost like a shadow branch of wildlife science. None of that is proof, but it tells you something important. An entire economy, an entire identity, quietly depends on nobody ever running the test that could end it for good. That assumption was wrong. And the first crack appeared exactly where you wouldn't expect it, inside a genetics department at the University of Oxford. In 2012, a human geneticist named Brian Sykes, a serious academic with a career built on tracing ancient DNA, did something that should have ended his credibility overnight. He and colleagues at the Lausanne Museum of Zoology put out an open call. Send us your Bigfoot hair. Send us your Yeti hair. Send us anything you believe came from an unidentified primate, and we will run it through the same mitochondrial sequencing used to trace human ancestry back thousands of years. Cryptozoologists had spent decades complaining that mainstream science refused to take them seriously. Sykes decided to call that bluff. The response was bigger than anyone expected. 57 samples arrived from museums, hunters, and private collectors across Bhutan, India, Indonesia, Nepal, Russia, and the United States. Some had been sitting in drawers for 50 years, collected on expeditions led by men whose names are in history books. One sample reportedly traced back to material connected to Sir Edmund Hillary's own Himalayan search for the Yeti. This wasn't internet ephemera. This was decades of serious, if desperate, collection finally reaching a lab capable of answering the question properly. But before a single test could run, the samples themselves started causing problems. Several submissions that had been treated as sacred proof for years turned out, under simple visual inspection, not to be hair at all. Plant fibers, glass fibers, material that had been stored, cataloged, and believed in for decades without anyone checking whether it was actually biological. That alone should stop you. Think about what that means. People built entire theories, entire expeditions, entire chapters of cryptozoological history around objects nobody had ever bothered to confirm were hair in the first place. Of the 57, 37 were judged worth sequencing. And here's where the suspicion starts compounding. Many of these hairs had been handled by dozens of human hands across decades, passed between collectors, displayed in cases, touched by curious fingers with no gloves and no protocol. Contamination wasn't a possibility. It was almost guaranteed. Every sample carried the fingerprints, literally, of everyone who had ever believed in it. 7 samples failed to yield usable genetic material at all. Whatever they were, whatever story had been built around them, science simply couldn't reach them anymore. That's not resolution. That's a door slamming shut on questions that will never get answered. 30 samples made it all the way through. And this is where the tempting theory enters the story. The one that had kept cryptozoology alive for 100 years. Some researchers, and a much larger community of enthusiasts, believed these hairs might trace back to a relic population of Gigantopithecus, a genuinely real, giant extinct ape known from fossil teeth and jawbones found across Asia. Believers argued that if Gigantopithecus survived in isolated pockets of the Himalayas or the Pacific Northwest, undiscovered, unbred with modern humans, it could explain centuries of consistent eyewitness descriptions across cultures that had no contact with each other. And Gigantopithecus itself has a strange origin story that makes the theory harder to laugh off immediately. Its existence wasn't confirmed through a dramatic excavation. It was confirmed through teeth, sold as dragon bones in Chinese apothecary shops in the 1930s, ground up for traditional medicine until a paleontologist named Ralph von Koenigswald recognized what he was actually holding. An entire species, real, giant, extinct, hiding in plain sight inside pharmacies for years before science caught up. If one giant primate could stay invisible to Western science that long, the argument goes, why not another? It's not an insane idea on its face. Large, undiscovered mammals have been found before. The question was always whether the evidence could survive contact with a real lab. Sykes ran the sequences against a global genetic database that catalogs known species by their mitochondrial signature, essentially a genetic barcode every animal on Earth carries and passes down through the maternal line. Type in the code, and the database tells you, definitively, what species you're holding. There's no ambiguity in this kind of match. It either lines up with something known, or it doesn't. One after another, the identities came back. Black bear, cow, horse, dog, coyote or wolf, raccoon, porcupine, sheep, deer. A Malaysian tapir thousands of miles from where a Bigfoot sample was collected, suggesting somewhere along the chain a specimen had been mislabeled or mixed up entirely. And one sample, treated for years as possible Yeti material, came back unmistakably human. Somebody's actual hair, sitting for who knows how long inside an archive built to catalog monsters. Picture the technician watching that particular result resolve on the screen, expecting an animal, watching a human signature line up instead, and realizing that a supposedly sacred relic had probably come from someone who simply touched it. Every single one of the 30 matched a known species. 0 came back unidentified. 0 matched anything resembling an undiscovered primate. On paper, that should be the end of the story. Case closed. Bigfoot debunked by DNA. That's exactly how most headlines ran it in 2014. And for most of the 30 samples, the headlines were right, but 2 of them weren't behaving like the others. 2 hair samples, one from Ladakh in northern India, one from Bhutan, thousands of miles apart, collected at different times by different people who had no contact with each other, both returned something the database couldn't cleanly place. Their closest genetic match wasn't a modern species at all. It was Ursus maritimus, the polar bear, and not a living one. The genetic signature aligned most closely with an ancient Paleolithic polar bear lineage, a version of the species that existed tens of thousands of years ago and has no business appearing in the Himalayas in the present day. Sit with that for a second. Polar bears live in the Arctic. They do not live in the mountains of northern India and Bhutan. There is no accepted population of polar bears, ancient or modern, anywhere near where these hairs were found. And yet 2 samples, gathered independently, both pointed toward the same impossible genetic address. This is exactly why I dig into cold cases like this one, the ones where science thinks it closed the file, and it turns out it didn't. If a bear nobody can classify was hiding inside a Bigfoot investigation, imagine what's sitting in the next file. Subscribe now, because the next one might be the case that finally breaks wide open. Sykes didn't call it proof of the Yeti. He was careful about that, publicly and repeatedly, but he also didn't dismiss it. His working theory was that somewhere in the high Himalayas there might exist an unknown or hybrid bear species descended from an ancient interbreeding event between polar bears and brown bears, a lineage that has gone unnoticed by science not because it's mythical, but because almost nobody has gone looking for it in the right place. That's not a Bigfoot discovery. That's arguably stranger. A genuine, unclassified large mammal hiding inside a folklore investigation never intended to find anything real at all. And this is where the official story, the Bigfoot solved headline, starts to crack. The test that was supposed to kill the myth accidentally uncovered a legitimate biological mystery that mainstream zoology still hasn't resolved. Nobody has recaptured a live specimen. Nobody has confirmed the hybrid theory. The polar bear match rested on a genetic fragment only about 100 bases long, short enough that some scientists later argued it wasn't decisive at all, and might instead reflect degraded, ambiguous DNA rather than a hidden bear lineage. The debate over what those 2 samples actually mean has never fully closed. Other researchers, writing directly in the same journal, publicly challenged Sykes' polar bear conclusion, arguing the match was more likely a byproduct of degraded DNA than evidence of a genuine hidden lineage. Sykes and his team responded, defending their interpretation, and the exchange sat there in the scientific record, two credentialed positions in the same publication, unable to fully agree on what those two hairs actually were. Which means the headline, "Bigfoot is debunked," was, at best, only half the real story. For years, that detail looked minor. It wasn't. While Sykes was building his case quietly and publishing through peer review, a very different kind of claim was building in the background, and it was about to blow up everything. A Texas veterinarian named Melba Ketchum had spent 5 years, starting years before Sykes' open call, collecting what she said were 111 samples of hair, blood, tissue, and toenail material from 34 sites across North America. In 2013, she announced something enormous. Her team claimed the mitochondrial DNA in these samples was unambiguously human, while the nuclear DNA contained novel, previously undocumented structure, and that the combination proved Sasquatch was a real, living hominin, a direct maternal descendant of modern humans, essentially a human hybrid species walking through American forests today. If true, that's not a headline. That's a redrawing of the entire evolutionary map. But here's the suspicious part. The part that should make you slow down immediately. Ketchum didn't publish this in a recognized, peer-reviewed journal. No major scientific publication would take it. Instead, the paper appeared in something called the De Novo Scientific Journal, a publication Ketchum's own team had reportedly created specifically to house the study. Think about what that means for a moment. If the results were airtight, any major journal would have fought to publish first. Instead, the science had to build its own house, because no established structure would let it in the door. That's not automatically proof of fraud. Extraordinary claims sometimes struggle to find a home. But when a claim this explosive avoids the exact scrutiny that would confirm or destroy it, suspicion is the only rational response. And the scientific community responded with exactly that. The mundane, far more likely explanation, according to outside geneticists, was contamination. Human mitochondrial DNA from careless handling, mixed with degraded or damaged nuclear material from an unrelated animal, misread by a lab that badly wanted a different answer. A result that looks miraculous can sometimes just mean the sample was compromised long before it ever reached a scientist. Ketchum didn't back down quietly, either. After the scientific community rejected her conclusions, she went further, issuing a public statement asking the United States government to recognize Sasquatch as an indigenous people, entitled to legal protection under human and constitutional rights. Think about the size of that claim for a moment. A request for legal personhood, built on a study almost no independent lab could replicate, published in a journal created by the same team that wrote it. Whatever you believe about the creature itself, that single request tells you how far this story had drifted from anything resembling standard science, and how badly one side wanted the myth to become undeniable, all at once, without going through the years of scrutiny that real discoveries usually require. So now you have two teams, both testing hair from the same legendary creature, arriving at almost opposite places. One followed transparent, peer-reviewed methodology and found ordinary animals plus one unresolved bear mystery. The other claimed history-altering proof and refused the exact process that could have verified it. Which one do you trust? The uncomfortable answer is that trust isn't really the right question. Verification is, and only one of these efforts survived contact with it. It's worth remembering this wasn't the first time the Bigfoot story collapsed under its own excitement. In 2008, two men in Georgia claimed they'd found an actual Bigfoot corpse, stuffed frozen into what looked like a broken refrigerator, and staged a press conference that made international news. A University of Minnesota scientist tested the material. The results? One sample was human. The other was 96% opossum, a marsupial roughly the size of a house cat. The men involved also happened to run a Bigfoot merchandise business. The financial motive wasn't subtle. It was the entire business model, and it worked. For about a week. Until the DNA said otherwise. That's the pattern hiding underneath this entire investigation. Every time the story gets a chance to prove itself under real scrutiny, it either produces an ordinary animal, a contaminated sample, or a financial incentive standing conveniently behind the discovery. And yet the story refuses to actually die, because buried somewhere inside decades of hoaxes and mislabeled museum drawers sits at least one result nobody can fully explain. Todd Disotell, a biological anthropologist at New York University who has spent years consulting on Sasquatch investigations and running his own molecular primatology lab, has been blunt about why he doesn't believe a breeding population of 8-foot mammals could survive undetected in North America. Modern forests aren't empty. They're covered in trail cameras, monitored by hunters, crossed by rangers, mapped by satellites. A species needs a viable breeding population to survive for generations, which means dozens or hundreds of individuals reproducing across time. Disitel's argument is simple and hard to dismiss. Hundreds of untraceable giant primates leaving behind almost zero physical evidence. In an era when everyone is carrying a camera, Strain's belief passed its breaking point. But strain belief isn't the same as impossible, and that's exactly the gap where the legend keeps living. There's a quieter conflict sitting underneath all of this testing, one that rarely makes the headlines. Saskets existed in indigenous oral tradition across the Pacific Northwest long before any lab, any hunter, or any television special claimed ownership of the story. For many communities, the figure was never a cryptid waiting to be captured and dissected. It carried cultural and spiritual weight that a mitochondrial sequence was never built to measure. When Western science steps in with a centrifuge and declares the case closed, it isn't just settling a zoological question. It's overwriting a story that belonged to someone else first, treating oral tradition as a hypothesis to be falsified rather than a tradition to be respected. That doesn't make the DNA results wrong. It does make case closed a much more complicated sentence than it sounds. Here's the deeper reversal buried in all of this. The investigation that was designed to kill Bigfoot for good didn't actually deliver a clean verdict. It delivered a split result. 90% boring, closed, resolved. 10% still open, still strange, still capable of embarrassing anyone who says the case is finished. That polar bear anomaly hasn't been erased from the scientific record. It's sitting there, unresolved, in a peer-reviewed paper, available for anyone who wants to reopen it. And that creates a real institutional tension nobody likes talking about. If mainstream science fully credits the unknown bear lineage, it validates the exact kind of amateur, crowdsourced sample collection that cryptozoologists have been doing for decades, the same community establishment scientists have spent years distancing themselves from. Admit the anomaly matters, and you're admitting the fringe method occasionally produces something real. Dismiss it entirely, and you're ignoring your own peer-reviewed data because the implications are inconvenient. Neither option is comfortable. So mostly, everyone just doesn't talk about it. Meanwhile, museums that once proudly displayed Yeti relics, sacred hair supposedly kept in Himalayan monasteries for generations, have had to quietly sit with the fact that their prized specimens were, when finally tested, just ordinary biology. Bears, cows, a tapir that had no business being there at all. Nobody wants to be the institution that admits its treasured legend was a horse. Reputational damage isn't limited to hoaxers. It reaches into respected collections that spent decades never asking the one question that would have solved everything years earlier. Lauren Coleman, director of the International Cryptozoology Museum, actually embraced Sykes' results rather than fighting them, calling the unknown bear finding exciting evidence that a scientific approach could still produce something real inside a field mainstream academia loves to mock. He had named Sykes Cryptozoologist of the Year before the paper even published. A strange kind of endorsement from the community whose founding legend the study had just quietly gutted. That's its own kind of twist. The community most invested in Bigfoot being real ended up being the one most willing to accept a result that, technically, proved it wasn't. Because it handed them something almost as strange to chase instead. None of the major institutions involved come out of this looking like villains, and that's worth sitting with. Sykes risked a respected academic career on a subject built to invite ridicule and published anyway. Museums that stored Yeti relics for generations weren't lying. They simply never had the tools, or perhaps never wanted the answer badly enough, to test what they were guarding. Cryptozoology groups weren't uniformly gullible. Some, like Coleman's museum, chose to follow the evidence even when it undercut their own founding premise. The only real losers in this story are certainty itself, and anyone who assumed the question had already been settled one way or the other. Samples are still being submitted. Independent labs still occasionally announce new tests. Bigfoot hunters still walk into forests carrying hair traps and patience measured in years, not weekends. The number of tested samples keeps climbing past that 270 mark, and each new submission carries the same tiny, stubborn possibility that the next one won't come back as a bear, a cow, or a raccoon. Sykes himself said it plainly. The fact that none of these samples turned out to be the creature people were hoping for doesn't mean the next one won't. So where does that leave the title's promise? Scientists really did test hundreds of samples. The results really are in, and the honest answer isn't the clean yes cryptozoologists wanted or the clean no skeptics expected. It's messier than either. Bigfoot, as a giant undiscovered primate walking through American and Himalayan forests, has never once survived contact with a real genetics lab. Not in 30 tested hairs, not in 111 contested ones, not in a stuffed corpse pulled from a freezer, but hiding inside that failure sits a real, unresolved biological question about an ancient bear lineage that modern zoology still can't fully explain, and a scientific credibility war between transparent peer review and a self-published claim that refused the one process that could have settled it for good. Picture that vial again, the one from Ladakh, still sitting in cold storage somewhere, labeled with a location, a date, and a genetic result that reads less like an answer and more like an open case file. 273 samples, give or take, tested across a decade of real science, and the honest headline was never "Bigfoot is real" or "Bigfoot is fake." It was that a joke got taken seriously enough to reveal a bear nobody can classify, a scandal nobody fully resolved, and a legend nobody managed to kill. Somewhere in a drawer, or a freezer, or a monastery relic case nobody has opened in years, there is almost certainly another hair sample nobody has tested yet. It might be a bear. It might be a cow. Or it might be the one that finally forces science to admit the file was never actually closed. Until somebody runs that test, the centrifuge keeps humming, and the mystery doesn't end. It just goes back into storage, waiting.